Well, hello. I see David Hayes in here. Sarah Z snuck in. How's it going, David?
Doing well. It's super nice to be here. I'm Richard. I'm looking forward to your talk. I've been admiring images of your work, and I've got my eye on a, well, actually more than one scholar's T-bowl. But I wrote to somebody up there to say, do you have a photo of the interior of that?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And did Daniel reply?
Yes, he did. And he doesn't know it yet, but it's convinced me to get it. So I'm very excited about it. It's one of
Good.
the blue, the blue and the green and the white tonalities.
Yeah,
It's the one that's not flared out a little bit. It's the one that's more, I
yeah.
don't know the name of that form, but yeah,
It's kind of almost like kind of like a barrel shape or
yeah,
a cup shape for tea. Yeah.
yeah,
And
beautiful.
the blue is coming from the navy bean straw ash glazes. And so in this presentation, you'll see how those materials have evolved.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I guess like little introductions. There's only a few of us here. David Hayes is the director of the landscape program here, Richard. And then Sarah Z's down here. She's a friend. She teaches up at University of Milwaukee. She was a friend from the School of the Art Institute circles. Cody Markells is hiding. He's a friend of mine who gave a lecture on Wednesday. He's a genetic biologist, and he gave a fascinating talk that went into like deep dives of understanding at a genetic level what happens if you simulate part of a field that would have the same environmental cues as 2050 under elevated CO2 or elevated nitrogen or whatever else. And he built these big gizmos and studied it. And, it was a fascinating talk, kind of in the context of this class. Oh, and then also Stephen Lemke, he's a sculptor, teacher, and longtime associate of Richard up at St. John's University. I think, and then Sarah Bresnahan, Richard's daughter, is here too. Nice, and I see a few faces I don't know, but and I'm wondering what the rest of my students are. There's a few of them. I'm missing a couple. But yeah, to give you guys like a little bit of context of the class, David sort of knows, but I guess Stephen and Sarah, and maybe just to kind of clue Richard in, even though we've talked about this a little bit, we're doing a vertical design studio, which is kind of at heart re-envisioning the Morrow plots, which is the longest experimental plot, and it's kind of celebrated on campus and in deference to the library, tucked under it and all this. But basically, the student's task is to design their own experimental landscape, but under the aegis of an experiment, right? So they have to kind of test it, and they have to think critically about what's changing and how the environment changes and how the people change, and kind of play that out over 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, however long it might be. And they're kind of developing their own sets, and some of them we're kind of talking about it and trying to figure out, hone in on what their interests are. And some of them, because they're landscape architects, are super wide ranging. They get into, macro scale systems of flows of energy, but also I want them to design a thing, right? Like, I'm going to teach them 3D modeling, and I'm a formalist at heart. And I feel like you have to 3D model an object, right, in order to render it and to look at it. And part of it's my architectural training. And I know landscape architects kind of paint with with a different language, I would say. But it's going to be interesting to see how that collides. And then they're going to have to deliver a story. And so at the bottom line, it's like a narrative about an experiment, right? And then how they come up with that, how they render that, what language they use to render that will be kind of up to them. And Richard, I think, is a storyteller at heart. And I think he has many hats that he wears up at St. John's University, which is up in central Minnesota. For those of you who haven't done a little bit of research on him quite yet, but if you get the chance to go up there, pop in, say hi to Richard. You can take a tour of the Marcel Breuer buildings and beautiful campus set amongst the kind of remnants of the great northern forest before it stops and turns into the Dakotas, right? And just barren prairie flatland. So Richard wears many hats. He's an environmentalist, I think, deep down, but he's a storyteller, and he tells stories with his preferred material, the material he knows best, which is clay, and that's the language. And he kind of works with that in order to encode histories, really old histories, but also to tell current stories and to work with material that people kind of passed right by, people drove over, and he kind of turns that into something that has resonance and that people can read across centuries, right? So he thinks about time, I think, in all of his work. But from a different point of view of Cody, the scientist, right? And from a different point of view of many of the landscape architects that you're going to be looking at. And in the spirit of this class, where we kind of cast a wide net for inspiration, I thought Richard would be a perfect fit to kind of tell his story. And of course, he's going to touch on kind of this foundational idea for your discipline, but specifically for this design studio, which is kind of time and how we critically examine time and tell stories about time. But yeah, I'll kind of let Richard introduce himself in the context of the talk for sure, and let you take it away, good sir.
Great. Great. Thank you, John, for taking the time to ask me to come and do a presentation to your students and to the faculty. I want to thank the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign for the opportunity to speak. I would like to kind of plow right into the lecture so that the students can see kind of the basic foundation of where this is going to be heading. In the left-hand image, you're going to see a excavation site that was being excavated in the 1980s. It's a 12th century excavation site in Tokoname, Japan, where they discovered a whole series of anagama kilns that were side by side each other. This is eco-architecture. So the reason why those kilns are side by side was that they were all designed to fit the need of what was being made. So the shape of the kiln was to fit the shape of the piece. And the elevation of the angle for going out the end of the anagama kiln was to the velocity of what the clay could manage in the sense of intensity. So as you traveled in the six old kiln regions of Japan, every particular region from Shigaraki to Tamba to Ichizen to Bizen to Tokoname all had different angles because the clay and the velocity reacted to the angle and the movement of the flame for vitrification and function. So in the right-hand slide, you can see that there's these ash deposits that are landing on the shoulders of pots. Chunks from the dugout clay kiln are falling down on the pieces. That marking is a mark by a farmer because this is basically agrarian in nature in the sense of its ecological systems, that they were making functional systems for either ocean vessels for fishing or for storage of food and fermentation processes. Some of the kilns, they have an interior posting in the left-hand side where that the arches are suspended and held up by these posts, but they're made almost like airline fins on an airplane, where that then the flame is directed to the sidewalls of the kiln. In the right-hand slide, you can see the scale of myself underneath. We were doing some digging there, looking for some additional shard work. And they had two firebox entrances that directed that flame over larger jars. And as that kiln then decreased in size, then the size of the jars were then smaller to finally large open dishes. So this particular ecological systems of landscape and human beings working with that also had to be generational. So here in the regions of Kyushu, we've traveled now further south, the mountain potteries there that have been working on those sides of those mountains for 260 years, multi-generational families, all the family members participated in the making of the pottery. So here's a mother and a father that are glazing and then getting a piece, large platter prepared for the firing. An elderly couple, the grandparents, she's glazing the interior of spice jars, or what they call musical show jars, for food storage. You can see in the background, just past her hat, where that they're drying the mountain iron clay that's pounded by water stampers. So when you come into the Onda village in this mountainside, you can hear the water pouring out of these dugout-like canoes on one part. And then as the water pours out, then this armature comes crashing down and pounds the iron rocky clay into a fine powder, and then it's washed and levigated, cut into square blocks, and then put on the kiln, the small bisque kiln, to dry. The right-hand slide is a gentleman who's 90 years old. When I would go up to visit them, he felt very much a vital part of the program of making, and that he was maybe not able to do a whole lot of throwing, but his sculptural qualities of doing dragon jars was really quite beautiful. And so you had 4 generations of people that were working together as a family in these pottery families. You can see in the left-hand slide slashes of wood that's being used for preheating the kiln. And in the wood burning kiln, there's multi-chambers. In the 1970s, you could actually see women carrying these slash wood pieces down from the mountainsides on their backs, on these kagos, these back carriers. So what was so important was energy efficiency. So one family's energy would be in one kiln. They'd be firing the one chamber, and the next family would load the next chamber, and the next chamber, the next chamber, and then they would fire 7 chambers together, 7 families working together. So one family's energy became the next family's energy. This is 4 times more efficient than my computerized car gas kilns that we have in a modern society, and using waste wood for its particular energy source. This multi-generationalism is exemplified in the place that I did my 4 years of study with the Nagasato family. They were brought over in 1593 as part of the Hideyoshi Wars in slavery to establish the high temperature Karatsu pottery. So whole villages of potters from Korea were brought over in bondage into Western and Southern Kyushu at that time to develop high temperature stoneware. They brought the information of the tools, the clay, the firing systems, the glazes, all to that particular region, bringing in the ancient Karatsu ceramics. This is the gallery and the museum area of the Nagasato family in the city of Karatsu, built in that kura kind of style, that elevated off the ground, where you actually go up into the galleries, and then there's a walkway that goes into the museum and tea ceremony room. When the pots are coming out of the kiln, they're carried down to the gallery to be looked over, boxes made, and then sold there. In between the gallery and the museum, a little stone boat being escorted by carpfish across the pond. That type of aesthetic was something very important as guests would walk in, to give them the sense of those spaces when coming to see the Nagasato's work. In the left and right hand images are Nagasato Muon the 12th. He was designated the National Living Treasure of Japan in 1976. His son Jusandai had pretty much taken over the pottery, the firstborn son. My teacher was the third born son, and Nagasato Takashi. And here he's still helping with unloading the kiln, and he's in his 80s, still investigating, still working. You can see that in the unloading of a kiln, there are a variety of styles. The Karatsu ceramics is known for its iron painted, very simple feldspathic glazed wood ash glazes, or more kind of the greener celadon glazes, as well as what we call the chosengaratsu. All of these glazes are made from their environment using the natural materials. They'll use the straw ashes from the local farmers' fields, the husks that come from the hulling of the rice, rice hulls in burning that for making glazed materials. So all of these are coming from a reflection of the environment. So in the nature of cultural regionalism, it's the nature of the material and the clay. So you can go into a museum and you can say, oh, that's a karatsu pot, or that is a bizen jar, or that is a Kyoto piece, because it reflects the nature of the natural materials of where the region is using those materials to make and form those shapes of function. So in the left-hand side, the very famous persimmon jar from the Momoyama period, and then the right-hand side from the Nagasato Takashi sake bottle with a straw ash glaze. The nature of making work on a potter's wheel, these are all handmade wooden kick wheels in what we call the Korean karatsu or karatsu style kick wheels. They would be use your feet for kicking the wheel and throwing at the same time. The central hearth, this is a summertime view of the central hearth. Instead of the wintertime having wood in it, it becomes a place for families and apprentices to gather to have a lunch before going back to work. And so as an apprentice for that period of time in Japan, you'd go from one form to the next in your making. And in the right-hand image in your screen, my teacher gave me this form. He said, he threw this and I started making this form. He said, make 1,000 of these for an order that he had. And I started making them. And finally, I just turned to him in Japanese and I said to him, what am I making? I have no idea what I'm doing. And he got up and walked out the room and disappeared for about a half an hour. And I thought, oh boy, here we go, lost in translation again. I must have not used the correct Japanese. And he came back later and he had a little branch in his hand. And he handed the branch to me. And potters in Japan are known for, their name is called kuchiganai. They have no lips. So in your teaching skill sets, you have teachers that try to instruct you in a form of a language. In Japan, as an apprentice, you never talked to your teacher at all. He'd make you a form. It was quiet in the studio or some sort of classical music might be playing. And you had to learn this next step by sight and by sound and by touch. So he said, you're making this. And he handed me this branch and he says, this is warisancho. This is one of the 7 sacred spices brought by Buddhist monks via China, via Korea. And this is what you're making. You're making a seed pod that holds 3 black seeds. So this is the empty pod that's dropped out the sancho seeds that we grind up to make a spice. And in the left-hand side, you can see the beautiful sashimi in the table, having dinner with those same dishes that I made, where that then you look at the food as if you're taking in the universe. So if some are familiar with what Zen painting is for the universe, it's a triangle, circle, and a square. You will serve your food always on a triangle, in a round obon and square table. That means you're taking energy of the universe into your system, into your body. So from that point on, I realized that the relationship with the environment was a synergetic step and a path that brought natural materials and your surroundings into that everyday experience. This is the home of Koyama Fujio, now since passed, and his studio where he had built a Tanegashima fire, and he died on the day I came to Karatsu, Japan. He was the director of the Tokyo National Museum. He started the National Living Treasures of Japan. He was the head of the Idemitsu Museum in Tokyo. And he was the one who invented the Tanegashima style, which I'm still firing today. This particular architectural structure in this landscape is by Kenzo Tange, and Kenzo Tange and Marcel Breuer of the Bauhaus Architecture School. Both were there before the Nazis closed it down in 1932. And Kenzo Tange and Breuer were very, very dear friends. This is the kiln shed going into the kiln, and this is what we call a teppo gama, long gun-shaped kiln. And it's already been preheated for 3 days. We fired this kiln for 9 days. stoking 24 hours a day. The flames coming out of, this was my first experience with wood firing as an American coming over as an apprentice. And I had this illusion or delusion, whatever you'd like to use for the word, that this was going to be this beautiful glazed work coming out, and similar to glazed ceramics that have been introduced to. And we're stoking wood right in among the pots, and the flames are shooting all over you. It's very, very difficult firing for the rest of that 9 days. Then 2 weeks to cool, and then we came back and started unloading this kiln. And on the left-hand image, you can see the pots are coming out of the kiln. They don't have any glaze on them. And I kept wondering, what is the big deal about this stuff? I could not figure out why they were so excited about this. And then when we started washing these pieces up, then you saw that the natural flow patterns of the flame narrative, or the natural ashes created these wonderful landscapes. This is a water jar by Koyama Fujio on the right-hand side and a tea bowl in the left-hand image. And the base of that foot is from a fumed glaze comes from coral and seashells from the ocean. So these natural materials using the environment of the flame to create these surfaces. I realized then that my colleagues or my teachers, from Peter Vokas to Mason and Rothman and De Stabler, were all looking for, in the 50s and the 60s, 1950s and 1960s and into the 70s, ways of creating natural surfaces to ceramics and using spraying on really toxic chemical oxides and everything to try and create these natural earthen surfaces. And here it was happening naturally in an organic flow pattern that I'd never seen before. That whole rhythm and pattern was part of every step of the live system that I was exposed to. So even with the traditional Japanese carpenters who were building my teacher's home, these were the temple carpenters from Japan, from Fukuoka. The joints, when they built his home, there was not a single nail in the whole structure. So here's a male and female joint being carved as the carpenters. They had no electric tools at all in the construction process. They'd be up at 5 o'clock in the morning, down at the stream below the studio, with 4 or 5 different sharpening stones, sharpening their chisels, sharpening their planer knives, sharpening their saws, so that they could make these very sophisticated joint systems that could withstand earthquakes, that they guaranteed would be standing for 140 years. That was the minimum standard they looked at in building structures. So here you can see that they're pounding a hardwood and expanding 2 joints to expand as a cantilevers over the concrete footing. There's a spirit tree in a house. When you create with the temple carpenters, there's called the hashida, a spirit tree. This tree was the center of the house, and where all the beams kind of were jointed into it. There was 12 complex joint systems that were in that one post, all carved and ready to go. They assembled this house in 10 days. They had made all the joints, and the majority of the joints and everything for building this house, and put it together almost like you'd put together some Tinker Toys or Legos or whatever kind of structure on a sophisticated level that was just mind-boggling. There was an elderly gentleman in here who made beautiful copper shingles by hand for the veranda, for the overhangs over a veranda. At that moment in time, I had realized that I'd been tricked, that all my education up until then was completely abstract, that what my teachers were giving me was this distant knowledge of abstract understanding of creativity. I could not connect the beautiful Muchi painting from the 12th century of the 6 persimmons that is one of the national treasures of Daitokuji Temple in Kyoto, to the simple persimmon flower that lay on the rock. I realized I had to go back and understand how I was going to take the hearth that I spent 3.5 years around, watching the wood smoke, smoking the fishes and the meats that were hanging from straw ropes in the left-hand image, how the smoke cured the basketry above the Idori top platform and welcoming our guests in for tea each day. How was I going to translate that functional welcoming of the hearth to the Marcel Breuer Abbey Church that was designed and built in the 1960s for this Benedictine monastery and abbey? So one of the things that I will read for you is a piece of poetry that I have at my potter's wheel each day. You cannot express unless you have a system of expression. You cannot have a system of expression unless you have a prior system of thinking and feeling. And you cannot have a system of thinking and feeling unless you have a basic system of living. That basic system of living was then my task: to return home to my place of birth, which was in the prairies of North Dakota, to ask that question. What is going to be the ecological, the eco-mutual path that I was going to take? And after those experiences of talking to friends and relatives, and to friends who I had left 4 years ago, part of the Native American community, I realized from their knowledge-based system, there is no way that the Christian cross and the white buffalo in the right-hand image were ever going to come together. That incredible base of knowledge was only going to be continued to be abused. This abuse keeps going on today. This is images, one a close-up image and one a more distant image. In the 1950s, when the Interior Secretary of State is signing away 440,000 acres of North Dakota land that was the indigenous peoples, tribes of the Hidatsa, the Wagla, the Arakawa, Mandan, that pushed further north to build the Garrison Dam. The man who's folding his hands in his face, weeping uncontrollably, the men that are looking away, not even looking at him signing, or their eyes are closed. Those are the Native American elders that came to Washington, D.C. to watch the Secretary of State sign their land away that had generation after generation of their burial grounds would be under 200 feet of water. That would be 200 miles long, 13 miles wide, never to have access again. So I had to go back further than that because to understand why this abuse and neglect cycle still continues in our ecological systems. This is Augustus the Strong of Poland. In 1652, he made a proclamation that if you have lots of porcelain around you, you're not going to die. The export porcelain market started from Chinese ceramics, and then during the Ming Dynasty Civil War, brought these porcelainic Koimari porcelains from Japan, which is in the right-hand slide in the image. Highly decorated, beautiful porcelainic materials that were brought over from one side of the planet on the other to the other, and could only be afforded by the elite or the rich of the European societies. So Augustus the Great called in his architects and his alchemists and said, invent me porcelain, invent me gold, and then calls his architects in and says, I want porcelain rooms because my doctor just told me if I have lots of porcelain around you, you're not going to die. Well, they all died, of course. No one's getting off the planet alive. But it was a great idea at the time because it was the first time Europeans were eating off of a sterile surface. You have to understand that The ceramics that came up to Northern Europe and European cultures came out of a desert culture from Turkey, Lebanon, into the Greco-Roman Empire. Lead glazed earthenware. Lead glazed earthenware works perfectly in a desert culture, optimum condition for the optimum environment. But because earthenware doesn't dry out, we know all about lead poisoning in glazes, but also that because earthenware doesn't dry out, it fosters bacterial growth and streptococcus and viruses. And so when they started eating off these porcelain dishes, the elite started feeling better. So build me porcelain rooms. So this is what the architects were doing. They looked at these porcelains with such admiration that they actually had goldsmiths working to add accoutrements of clocks and candelabras onto these exotic things coming from the other side of the planet. Well, what happened to those environments on the other side of the planet from those export markets, from that extraction, from that use of those materials? This is for those people that be interested historically, this is came as a publication from the November 18th issue of the National Geographic. Because of World War I, this publication, this particular series of articles and photographs weren't able to come out till November 18th of 1918, because it was actually the photographer and the writer were in China in about 1910, exploring the imperial porcelain centers. And this is a photograph on the left-hand side of the hundreds of kilns that were firing porcelains for the export market. This from this imperial household kilns. Here are the potters doing glazing of the pieces. The man in the left-hand image, he got paid the most because he was using a tube, a bamboo tube, to blow the glazes as he's using his foot to have it go around in a circle to evenly glaze the porcelain materials. Because of the way that you blow those types of glazes onto his lungs would fill up with silicosis, and his average age of life was about 32 years of age. The right-hand side shows these teapot forms. At that time in China, nobody drank out of teapots like that. E.F. Schumacher, who wrote the book, Small is Beautiful, said, when you no longer know what the materials that you're making and no longer know what their usage is, you then abuse your materials. If you're employees, if you have more than 50 employees, you will abuse those employees. You lose the familial structure. So many of the pieces that were sent for the export porcelains, the particular people making them never used them. They had run out of wood, so the explorer that was coming up the river to explore the Chin-to-Chen pottery studio, pottery kiln sites, said there wasn't a tree within 150 square miles. They had cut down all the trees. The landscape was like a desert. Pity the poor potter. He could not even grow his own food. In the right-hand image, you can see then the square blocks of white. They had run out of porcelain, so they had to have porcelain brought down from other clay deposit sites down to the Chin-to-Chen area for porcelainic development. But what I'd like you to take a close look on your side is the mountain or the hillside behind those boats that are unloading and loading these materials for porcelain making. That right-hand image where all the boats are, that goes for 300 yards, and it's about 90 feet tall. Those are the broken shards that didn't make the standard by the European export-import marketers that said they all had to look exactly the same. So we're firing pieces up to 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit with wood. We will be putting them in a kiln and out of kiln up to 7 times because of all the different kinds of enamels and colors. 7 energy units, and if it doesn't look exactly like the other ones, then we break it. At the bottom of that 90-foot hillside is called guanware, this beautiful crackled glaze. And the reason why that was so sought after was that this was a single energy unit firing system. They made the piece on the potter's wheel, they dipped it in glaze, and the everyday use of it developed the staining of the crackle on the glazes. So these pieces were so coveted and so loved that even if they had a chip that was broken on the neck of the bottle, they would make these beautiful silver extension pieces so that they could still be used. In the right-hand photograph is a Kohler sink. They made Kohler toilets and Kohler sinks with a random crackle pattern. So when we were taking a tour of the Kohler industry in Kohler, Wisconsin, just north of you, where you may be at school, the tour guide said how wonderful it was that they could take a Pentium chip computer and make a random crackle pattern like the early Sung Dynasty blue and white porcelains, the guanware, and we'd fire it 3 times in a kiln to get this wonderful effect. So they're firing that sink and that toilet in the sink 3 times, 3 energy units, to emulate the 1 energy unit of the early ceramics. I highly doubt that this is called progress. So the decision from the studio at St. John's was to only use the natural materials in the area in all of our making. In Minnesota, our finest clay deposits get mixed into Class 5 gravel to make for shouldering and road construction, and Class 2 gravel as well. They need clay deposits to be mixed into gravel so you can compact your roads, so you can put your asphalt and your concrete on them. This is what was going to be happening to this particular deposit. It was in a road in Collegeville Township that was, the contractor didn't do his job and dig out the clay deposit out of the road. He just covered it up with some Class 5 gravel, and the cars would slide off in the winter or in the spring thaw cycles because the road was too slippery. So I went to them in 1979 and I said, I'll take the clay deposit, and if you'd want to give it to me, and we'll bring in a heavy moving company and dig the clay deposit out and preserve your road. They said, when can you start? So in 1979, I went to Father Michael Blecker, the president of St. John's at that time, who had invited me to be artist in residence of the university and to develop this indigenous development of working only with natural materials and reuse systems without doing extreme extraction. And so I went to Father Michael and I said, I'd like to dig enough clay to last 300 years in pottery making at St. John's, looking 7 generations ahead. But I need to balance my budget. And Michael turned to me in his office chair and he says, well, Richard, he said, in 1,500 years of Benedictine monastic history, 300 years is not all that long. I trust what you're doing. For the faculty at different universities that may be listening, what chairman of an art department would be able to go to the provost of any university and say, I'd like to dig 300 years of pottery for my university for the idea of making before they contaminate it and throw it away? The provost will look at you and say, how long do you think tenure is going to last? Not only in the making of working with clay, so we brought 18,000 tons of this clay material over to St. John's for 300 years of pottery making. It was 275 13-yard dump truck loads and hauled for 3.5 days until one of the land managers, Father Jim Tingerthal, said to me, say, Richard, how long do you plan on living? Which was the signal for me to kind of don't dig any more clay. And then we went out to our relatives out in North Dakota in the prairies, and I asked my relatives if I could burn a straw stack. This is the Red River Valley in the left-hand image, 2 large straw stacks of navy bean straw. We burn that very slowly and put it into metal barrels, bring it back to the university, wash it, ball mill it. And this is the glazes that it gives on the right-hand side, mixed with clay and wood ashes. This is out in the prairies of more central North Dakota, burning flax straw ash at my Uncle Leo's farm and giving them, my Aunt Hildegard, pieces like this from the firing of those particular flax straw ash glazes. When I first asked my relatives if I could burn some straw, they said, they just thought I was crazy. They always remembered me as a black sheep in the family, but now they kind of figured that was it. But then when you bring your Aunt Hildegard beautiful pieces like that she can show off to the rest of the relatives, all of a sudden the whole relationship changed pretty dramatically. This is the nature of also Benedictine monks not wanting to tear down their history. In the back of this left image, you see the Marcel Breuer dormitories, beautiful Marcel Breuer designed dormitories. In the middle of this particular area was the agrarian, still the history of the agrarian culture. So this was their bunkhouse, this was their tack and livery room, and underneath this is where I had the studio for the first 13 years. And there are underground vaults that they stored their roots and carrots and all of their, some of their vegetable crops. And out where the Marcel Breuer buildings were irrigated gardens for the monastery because they had big dairies. They, when they came out here in 1853 and started building, this building that you're seeing is the old Joe Hall. Those bricks, those monks were making 10,000 bricks a day and firing them in stove kilns to build the interior structure, the first beginning structures of the monastery environment. So Brother Dietrich Reinhardt, who became president in 1991, decided we're not tearing down our history to build a new student union. We're not scraping things off, which is a 21st century, very terrible language for a vocabulary to get rid of our history. The building was then lifted up with 18 747 wheel assemblies, 144 tires. The building weighed 720 tons. And they had to build a road underneath it so that then they could pull it down into the middle of the campus and then bring it in to build a brand new studio. So Dietrich said, design studios. The president said to me, design in 1991, new studios, new kilns for 21st century learning. In the left-hand image, this is the Johanna kiln. It's a 87-foot long wood burning kiln, 3 chambers that fires 3 distinctly different styles of firing. The one in the right-hand slide you see is Tanegashima. And one of the things I want to point out in this is that you see all these kind of brown fibrous materials in amongst the kiln posting. This particular loading of this kiln started in 1979 when I came to St. John's and built the first wood burning kiln. Brother Julius, who was a monk, brought two elders down from Red Lake Indian community, the reservation of Red Lake, Minnesota. And I had gone to high school at the prep school, and 3 of my classmates were young men from the Red Lake Native American community. And they came down, excuse me. They came down to see the firing for the first time. And I was, when you're young and in your 20s, you're kind of a whiner. And so I was kind of complaining about the fact that I had not found materials I was looking for natural materials, for loading and firing. And I was having to wad everything and talking about how I couldn't get the flame narrative like I wanted to. And I talked to them about on Tanegashima Island, how they used rice hulls on the kiln shelves. And when one of the elders it was 5 o'clock in the evening when they decided it was time to go to the mass at the Abbey Church with Brother Julius. I was holding the car door for one of the elders, and he says to me, looked at me and he says, "What about wild rice hulls? My nation gifts this to you. My nation gifts this to you." So I called up a place by Brainerd, Minnesota, at Deerwood, Minnesota, called Deerwood Rice and Grain, and they did wild rice hulling. And I talked to Travis's mom and dad and asked, do you have any wild rice hulls that I could buy? And they said, how many semi-loads do you want? And I go, what? He says, we have to push actually bulldozers of this material up into piles into the swamps. And I said, I'll be up tomorrow just to take a look. So you get in my old van, drove up there, and a beautiful family, and they've been doing hulling of wild rice for now they're in their third generation. And the beautiful wild rice hulls would be blown out into a pile, and they would just push it into the back area where there was a low-lying wetland, beautiful wetland area. So I took the wild rice hulls, and this is how we stack. So you can see the pottery is stacked one piece on top of another. There's a 4-foot stretch plate, 5-foot stretch plates, fired upside down on cups, wild rice hulls, separating those. Wild rice hulls don't melt till 2,320 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a natural refractory. At the lighting of the Johanna kiln, this is the last, the Johanna kiln was named after my teacher, Sister Johanna Becker, the great Asian art historian. This is the last lighting ceremony that she was at. She was able to light all of the first 10 firings of the Johanna kiln, and then passed away before we were able to, before we could do the next firing. But a great teacher. We have a lighting ceremony. We have 300 to 400 people come, and then we serve them dinner. The team of people that have helped so much in the past, there's over 45 people that come to help with this firing. It takes 2.5 months to load, 10 days to fire, with 45 people, 5 cooks. My wife Colette works extremely hard on getting meals for and recipes and food for everybody, because sometimes we'll have 90 people for dinner, sometimes 300 people for dinner, who are coming here to see the firing. The nature of the firing is that we fire then over that 10-day period, the last 4.5 days of firing the Tanegashima chamber. And the Tanegashima chamber has got 9 stoking windows on each side of the that particular 22-foot long chamber, and we're stoking wood in amongst that. That chamber is 6 feet by 7 feet, 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall. So it takes about 10 to 12,000 pieces to fill the kiln for the firing. So it takes about 2 years of a cycle. And these are the people that were here to help in the firing of the 14th firing in memory of Mitsuo Kakutani, the great artist, matter painter, professor at Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, one of my best friends. He passed away, and we did a memorial fire in his memory. The early kiln firings, and was here for almost every one of the Johanna kiln firings. His wife and dear friends hold his photographic image, and these are all the people that came to celebrate and work on helping with that firing, people from all over the world and people from all over the United States. So those people make this happen. This is a stretched sushi platter about 3.5 feet in length, fired upside down on a bed of wild rice hulls in the Tanegashima chamber, slip painted with matter painting that is of my work. And all those color palettes that you see of the yellows, the blues, the oranges, the patterns of browns, iridescence from the wild rice hulls are what the kiln is making, not what the potter's making. So when you talk to the new apprentice who's coming to the studio, you remind them, 1/3 is to allow the materials to speak. 1/3 is the artist being able to speak. And 1/3 is the firing being able to speak. Collaboration is very important, and how to unlearn. Buckminster Fuller talked about how we unlearn ideas to come up with the right pattern for the earth. These are what we call Chinese and Korean wine ewers. That's where we got the concept of the teapot from. The idea of the design of the spout and the handle The handle was never to be touched or held onto. The body of the teapot sideways was held on by your hand, and you poured wine in court ceremonies or religious ceremonies out through the spout. And the handle's design was to emulate the movement of the spout design. And we adopted our teapot form for the last 400 years, from when tea was first brought by the British and Dutch trading companies to Europe. This is what they used to decant with hot water the green tea, which then turned bitter and taken back to India to make black tea. So in order to make good tea drinking, these are collaborations between the artist Paul Kruger, renowned knotting artist, and myself, where then he hand weaves rattan to make the handles around the teapots, a gourd in the right and a kind of wide flat. This is an architectural program. How do we make a piece for great green tea drinking? Elevated feet, very thin bottom. The pot is fired upside down in the firing, so that because the base is very thin and wide, so the teapot will cool off and not make the leaves bitter. A downward pouring spout so it doesn't drip. You have a handmade clay screen on the interior. The lid is a round spherical form. Buckminster Fuller talks about the sphere being the strongest. How do we keep from planned obsolescence? So a rattan handle is not going to be as fragile, because any teapot with a side handle is planned obsolescence. That type of engineering structure is made to be broken at some point in time. With all these different points of departure from this rattan and the rattan whippings that hold this together, it makes for a very indestructible piece. Paul Kruger, then we moved that into the idea of the cake plate, where he's actually doing architectural design with flowing of rattan, various whipping knots and running Turk's head knots, Spanish ring knot, love knots, and tying down on these serving plates, so that the architectural handle frames in the view of the food. I've seen wonderful creative artistic chefs wrap these handles with nasturtium and other edible flowers, and then beautifully putting the food in the center of these dishes. Absolutely stunning effects for the presentation of food. The other aspect of the studio is to be welcoming of artists. We've had visiting artist programs and apprenticeship programs since the onset of the program since 1979. One of my dear friends, Koya Ryoji, who was instrumental in my growth in Japan, and then would come to St. John's numerous times to make pieces to be sent back to Japan. He began his work in dealing with the Holocaust of nuclear weapons. He grew up during World War II. He saw the devastation of the nuclear Holocaust of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are testimonials to where he would melt the clocks at the temperature of the nuclear weapon going off at a certain distance. He would melt sewing machines at temperatures on top of these systems to show you the devastation of these particular time periods. He made beautiful work. Koya Ryoji, my dear friend, died on August 6th of this last year in 2020 from on the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima from COVID. Other artists who are taking waste material. Here in the right-hand side, you see cardboard boxes of different thrown out cardboard boxes, hand cut and layered upon layered. And then when you turn that piece, where you're looking it on visually, you can see right through that bodhisattva of healing, how we look at the waste material of a society. How do we create a healing material of society? Kondo-san, whose family was over 10 generations of porcelain makers, similar to the very fine porcelains that you see at Arita Koimari's Chinese porcelains, highly painted. During the Fukushima meltdown of those core reactors in Japan, during the Fukushima tsunamis and the floods that inundated those communities. in homage to those people who died, he did a body cast of himself and then used the waste cobalt material that was in the garbage from the recycling of the waste cobalt, and then painted that body and then used silver nitrate to fire the beads to look like the sweat of people dying of nuclear poisoning. A powerful piece of contemporary environmental art. For my work, I prefer that everything that I do has some sort of relationship in a story or in the dealing with the environment. Here is a series of platter pieces of the prophetic messenger that I started working on in the late 1980s. The horse coming down on beams of golden light through an archway. In 2017, I was commissioned to do the first sculpture of the John Hazlitt Garden. And what I decided was I was going to take the prophetic messenger into a new dimension. That I would look at what does it mean in the 21st century to be an ecological artist, an ecological maker. And so in this first sculpture of the John Hazlitt Outdoor Sculpture Garden, I decided that I would do 178 of these small jars, each carved with the prophetic messenger horse coming down, trying to get through the archway to alert humanity of its needs to listen. And inside those jars, in the left-hand image, is the seeds of the three sisters: corn, beans, squash, and pumpkin. And in those, so you can see there's a small hermetically sealed packet of 10 seeds, a spiritual number for seeds, that you will then hold inside and hold precious. And then I wrote on handmade Japanese paper the nature of the seeds. Some of the seeds of the beans that you're seeing are the 1,500-year-old genetics of cave seeds that came out of the southwestern United States. And in the right-hand image is a ode to the artist. So after the death of John Prine from COVID in April of this last year, and John was a friend of mine, and I'd met him, and I had deeply attached, and I felt so overwhelmed with emotion when it came out on the BBC, you know, in the late at night. And I called John McCutcheon, my friend in Atlanta, and I said, God, John just died. And so I decided that no one will remember the artists when they're gone. No one can give you praise from the grave. So I decided I would write a couple paragraphs about each of the artists who are my heroes, who I deeply admire, who have such positive energy for this world. And I would wrap not only those seeds and the information in that around that packet, but the artist and his or her name and what that artist, his or her, mean to me and their history. Small little paragraph. So, and then these seed systems are then sealed with cork and the champagne corks. And then my wife has, Colette has these beautiful bees, and the beeswax would melt, and I would dip the corks in the beeswax to seal them. And then those little caps, another ceramic cap would go on the top, and then that's sealed. And then I would pack anywhere from 14 to 16 of these seed pods inside larger jars that were packed with wild rice hulls all the way around them to mitigate movement of air circulation in and around the seeds, and then a lid over the top of that and sealed. And then along with that, we did a scroll 28 feet long of the Rule of Saint Benedict and another ceramic tube that's going to go inside a spiritual container, a kura. So for landscape architects, especially for the students that I'm speaking to that are going into architecture and landscape architecture, all of a sudden you get a commission to be the first sculptor to make a piece for the John Hassler Sculpture Garden. And you're walking around these sites, and what are they? Here on the left, I was able as a high school student to listen to Marcel Breuer speak about what space meant, what it was like to build spaces, and what it was like to have to leave and escape the Nazis as a Polish Jew to come to a different country. He had built 13 buildings by that time on St. John's campus and was designing more. And the Marcel Breuer Library, one of the students in this, when he was giving these really wonderfully personal talks, said, "Mr. Breuer, what's your favorite building of all that you do?" And I'm sure that, you know, architectural teachers and architects and everything have heard, "What's your favorite pot?" or "What's your favorite work of art?" And Marcel said, "My favorite architectural work that I've done is this library right here." And I remember that. So when I received the commission to have the first piece of sculpture to be put next to Marcel Breuer's building, it was this great weight that came out and rested on my shoulders. Here was this hero of mine who I was going to have a sculpture next to, and how was I going to treat that hero? So the slab that you're seeing is being lowered by the 60-foot crane. This site had a lot of problems. You couldn't bring the heavy tonnage of granite in. This slab of granite came off the library where that walkway was cut into the Alcuin Library to build the Learning Commons, which is then across the little parkway from the science building. So the aspect of, I asked the physical plant director, don't throw that slab of granite away that they were cutting off the building. Please save it out in the boneyard. So that 4-ton piece of granite we're lifting over, and that's the base of the sculpture. So that piece of granite has only been moved 30 feet away from its original destination and repurposed. Then in the second slide to the right, we're hauling in and dropping into place these tall granite, black granite concrete pieces that are 9 inches thick, 8.5 feet tall, and 26 inches wide. These were the steps of the Abbey Church that were quarried in 1873, and the only black granite deposit in St. Cloud, Minnesota, was the black granite that made the prison. So these steps were quarried by prisoners. And the old line shot drawing carvings that went into the surface, tens of thousands of people's feet over 125 years have worn those stones to absolute beauty. And so we were able to save those stones. I've been looking at those stones for 33 years and needed to make them as part of this project. So here's the recycled granite going into place, and then we're lowering in the kura, which is stainless steel and stainless steel mesh in the structure. And this, the strapping that goes around the right image is a 300-pound pink quartzite stone with the prophetic messenger carved into it and fired in the wood burning kiln. Pink quartzite stone in southern Minnesota is the only stone known to mankind that you can fire in to high temperatures of 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit, not melt or blow up. So here you can see that the armatures are being put into place. And then this is the load in time where that we're then loading in the all of the 173 jars, 78 jars, and the large scroll container, 40 feet. And then the right-hand image, a stainless steel roof, and then a rubber membrane and a standing seam red roof to put on top of it. The red roof is a nod of standing seam to Marcel Breuer's tile shims that are on the exterior. The golden cables are to remind us that the beams of golden light that carry this container in suspension. The white is a marble-based stucco cement with wild rice hulls that has been worked into that surface. So, and then a ceramic cap fired in the wood firing that's put on top of the, so somebody said, well, this is a time capsule. I said, no, this is not a time capsule, because every culture starves its population at some point in time. And at some point in time, when those people need to get at those 173 non-genetically modified, open pollinated systems, they're going to lift off that lid, unscrew the lid, lift it off, and get at those seeds that have been preserved to plant. Because some of those squash seeds I received from Winona LaDuke, who was at a Milwaukee excavation site of Native Americans, where that they discovered a ceramic ball that had squash seeds in it that were 800 years old that grew. So in those genetics are those genetics from our indigenous communities. Where do our teachers come from? Oftentimes, they may not be in the universities. When we had the first firing of the Johanna kiln in 1995, a gentleman gave me these, I came in and bought 2 swirl cups from the Tanagashima chamber. He said, I'm going to send these to my son for Christmas. I said, okay. We mailed them to his son for Christmas. Christmas time, a young gentleman comes in my studio, tall, long hair, and said, my father sent me 2 cups all the way to Texas, and I want to talk to you. I said, sure, come on, let's have some tea. And he says, I'd like to see all of your information on how you fire your kilns. I said, sure, okay. So we pulled out all of the information of when we put, when we're firing the kilns, and I showed him, these charts. He says, can I see your kiln? And I said, sure. So we walked down to the kiln shed, took a look at the kiln, and I told him, here's how we fired. And he says, where do you put the water in the kiln? And I said, well, the water goes in at high temperatures underneath the grate at 2,300 degrees to create these hydrogen oxygen clouds that go through these membranes of charcoal at 2,200 degrees to create new atmospheric environments. He says, okay. So we come back and we're having tea, and he's sitting across the table, and he looks at me and says, you're doing the same thing I'm doing. And I said, really? I said, you're a potter from Texas? And he says, no. He says, I'm an astrophysicist, and my research is in the Orion nebulas. My name is Luke Keller. And if there's anything that you'll remember about this lecture, is that Luke designs infrared telescopes. He teaches astronomy in Ithaca, New York, and designs infrared telescopes at Cornell. He's the data processor for the SOFIA project, which gets on a 747 and goes and flies up at nighttime at 42,000 feet. And they open up a garage door, like 12 by 12 foot door. And this broadband telescope goes out in the nighttime sky, and they're able to see things that the Hubble and the Spitzer infrared telescopes can't see. And he said, what you're doing in your kiln is the same thing I'm doing, and my PhD research is in the Orion nebulas. And when you get older in life, those gray cells up in here, up on the top of your head, get stiff sometimes. And you say, boy, okay, I'm going to try and go with this. So the little gray cells are not working real good today, but we're going to listen. And so he says, no, he said, what you're doing is the same thing I'm doing, is that it's 10 to the power of 19. That is the gravitational force that holds all of the molecular life on planet Earth together. And it's 10 and so I'm going to send you slides from our research projects and NASA and those kinds of things to show you what happens with hydrogen oxygen clouds in creating new forms and new development. He said, what you're doing is at probably at the power of 19 3/4, given the pressure of the firing and its temperature, is you're creating new star formations and new atmospheric clouds, creating patterns that we can only see in 1,500 light years of space, because there's only 100 molecules per every square centimeter out in space. So after Luke sent me these images of looking at these particular movements of the universe, he says it's a macrocosmic world that you're in, that you're also firing in a microcosmic universe. So that is no longer the way I making pottery and firing the kiln. I can no longer look into the kiln at these high temperatures flowing through and see that just objects are being made or functionalism being made. These 45 people, these hundreds of people who come to see, are seeing this little cosmic macro window on the universe. So in the final slide, which I've gone a couple minutes over, I'm going back to the young students in the landscape architecture department for just a moment, that this is the Moss Temple Garden in Kyoto. It was designed by Muso Soseki in the 12th century. It's called Kokidera at the Saihoji Temple in Kyoto. There are over 325 different varieties of moss in this temple garden. And you have to spend about a half an hour in the temple copying a sutra as a monk is chanting with your group. Copy a sutra of prayers that go in the pagoda as a gift from your hand to prepare you to go inside the garden. You're the only ones, that group are the only ones that are in the garden. The gate is open and you walk in. And I can remember walking up and seeing this flotilla of stones in the left-hand side. And I don't know how long I stood there, but I recognized that there was someone who had come up alongside me. And it was the abbot of the monastery. And he said, in broken English, "Do you know why these stones are here?" And I said, "I have no idea why these stones are here." And he said, "These are the 7 stones of the sacred healing plants brought from China by monks. So this flotilla of stone that's going across the pond is to remind us that the earth is a healing place." So you go a little bit further in the garden, and then I walked upon a sunken boat. So if you look on the right-hand side, you can see a sunken rowboat, just the outline of the rowboat between the pine trees. And coming from Minnesota, anybody who left their boat in the lake water for the wintertime was not a good lake owner, or he wasn't a good keeper of his boats. Everyone has to take their dock out in the fall and get their boats put into storage and everything. And here is this boat that's just left in this beautiful garden, sunken. And I said, why in God's world would someone leave a boat in such a beautiful garden? And then it came to me that when you are in paradise, you no longer have to wander. When you're in paradise, you can let your boat be at rest. Thank you.